The Arizona Territory, 1887. Elizabeth Caldwell stood at the edge of her father's property, the weight of 30 years of isolation pressing down on her slender shoulders. Not once in her life had she known the simple comfort of a loving touch. Behind her stood the cold farmhouse where laughter never echoed, where embraces were forbidden as sin itself, a cruel world of rules without reason. She pulled her thin shawl tighter as the winter wind cut through the canyon, much like the loneliness had cut through her heart for decades. The approaching blizzard mirrored the storm raging inside her. Tonight would be her last on this earth. Would her final breath go unnoticed, just as her entire life had been? Could a stranger from a world so different from her own possibly see the woman no one else had ever truly seen? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Caldwell farmhouse had always been a place of shadows. From her earliest memories, Elizabeth recalled the heavy footfalls of her father, Reverend Josiah Caldwell, as he paced the floorboards with his weathered Bible clutched in calloused hands. That Bible, its leather cover worn smooth at the edges, pages marked with crimson ribbon at passages about sin and damnation, was the true master of their home. "The flesh is weakness," he would recite, his voice a solemn drone that filled the austere rooms. "Physical indulgence is the pathway to moral corruption." Elizabeth was 5 when she first understood what those words meant. She had been at the general store in Copper Springs, watching wide-eyed as Mrs. Peterson embraced her daughter after a minor tumble. Something in that simple act of comfort stirred a longing so profound that Elizabeth, without thinking, had reached for a young boy. Standing nearby, their small arms had barely encircled each other before Reverend Caldwell's shadow fell across them. The silence on the wagon ride home had been worse than any shouting. When they arrived, he had opened his Bible without a word and pointed to passages about temptation and impurity. Then came her punishment, a day confined to her room without supper, forced to recite verses about the sanctity of the body. "Your mother died bringing you into this world," he told her afterward, his voice flat as the barren fields surrounding their property. "Her touch was taken from me because of weakness. I'll not lose you the same way." Elizabeth learned quickly. The walls of the farmhouse became the boundaries of her world. The servants who tended to their needs were instructed never to make contact. Only Martha, the aging housekeeper who had been with them since before Elizabeth's birth, occasionally dared to brush against her hand when passing a dish or straightening her collar. Fleeting moments of human connection that Elizabeth treasured, like water in the desert. At night, alone in her sparse bedroom, Elizabeth developed rituals to simulate the touch she craved. She would wrap her own arms around her shoulders, pretending they belonged to the mother she had never known. She kept a small collection of things that others had touched: a ribbon dropped by a girl at church, a coin exchanged at the market, and would press them to her cheek when loneliness threatened to consume her. The house itself seemed to reinforce her isolation. High ceilings that swallowed sound, wide hallways that discouraged proximity, furniture arranged at disciplined distances. The few decorations were stark religious scenes: Daniel in the lion's den, Abraham preparing to sacrifice Isaac, reminders of faith tested through isolation and obedience. As Elizabeth grew into womanhood, her father's vigilance never wavered. When fever took him to bed one winter, it was Martha who tended him, while Elizabeth was kept at a distance, denied even the chance to cool his brow or hold his hand. "Your touch would only weaken him," Martha explained apologetically, her eyes reflecting a sadness that suggested she understood the cruelty of these boundaries. In her 20th year, Elizabeth found a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards of her mother's former sewing room. Inside was a daguerreotype, her parents on their wedding day. They stood apart, as was proper for a formal portrait, but her mother's eyes held a warmth that Elizabeth had never seen in her father's home. She wondered what had happened to transform that young pastor into the cold man who had raised her. What kind of touch had her mother offered that, once lost, had hardened him so completely? Martha found her studying the image and sighed heavily. "He wasn't always thus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grief changes a person, child. Some hearts open to comfort others in their pain. Some close forever to avoid feeling it again." Elizabeth slipped the photograph back into its hiding place, understanding that she was living in a house built not on religious principle, but on unresolved grief, a monument to a love that had died with her mother's last breath. Copper Springs existed in Elizabeth's mind as a place of noise and motion, a stark contrast to the tomb-like silence of the Caldwell farm. Their monthly trips to town for supplies were both torment and treasure. She would observe from a careful distance as families greeted each other with embraces, as shopkeepers clasped hands with customers, as children tumbled together in play without fear of retribution. "They don't understand the dangers of such familiarity," her father would mutter, steering her away from these displays with a hand that hovered near, but never touched, her shoulder. The trading post at the edge of town was where Elizabeth first glimpsed another way of living. Unlike the white settlers, who maintained careful distance in their transactions, the Apache, who came to trade, moved in fluid harmony with one another. Children rode on mothers' backs, elders guided youngsters with gentle hands, warriors stood, shoulder to shoulder in quiet solidarity. "Savages," the townspeople would whisper, but Elizabeth saw nothing savage in their easy physicality. If anything, the rigid separation her father enforced seemed the more unnatural state. It was at the trading post that Elizabeth received her first gift. She had been examining a bolt of calico, imagining a new dress that might bring some color to her monochrome existence, when an elderly Apache woman approached. Without a word, the woman pressed a small wooden bird into Elizabeth's palm, a simple carving of a sparrow in flight. Before Elizabeth could respond, the woman had disappeared back into the crowd, leaving only the warmth of the brief contact lingering on Elizabeth's skin. She had hidden the bird in her skirt pocket, heart racing with the forbidden thrill of the exchange. That night, alone in her room, she had traced its smooth contours and imagined soaring beyond the boundaries that confined her. The Reverend spoke often about the Apache problem, as most settlers did. The tribe's reservation boundaries were constantly disputed, with rumors of warriors slipping away to hunt on traditional lands, now claimed by ranchers. Yet Elizabeth had never witnessed the violence that populated her father's sermons. The Apache, she observed, seemed intent only on maintaining their way of life amid the encroaching tide of settlers. "That Caldwell girl," she would sometimes overhear. "In town, strange as they come. Never seen her so much as shake a hand. Pride, I reckon, or some peculiar notion her father's put in her head." Pride had nothing to do with it. Elizabeth had developed a silent hunger for connection that grew more acute with each passing year. She would linger near groups of young women her age, listening to their easy laughter and casual touches, a hand on an arm to emphasize a point, a quick embrace in greeting, the brushing back of a stray lock of hair. She catalogued these gestures, in her mind, practicing them in secret with her own reflection. When Elizabeth was 25, influenza swept through Copper Springs. Her father, ever fearful of contagion, restricted their trips to town even further. It was Martha who brought news of the deaths, including that of the physician who had refused to treat Apache patients at the onset of the outbreak. "The tribes have their own healers," Martha told Elizabeth, as they preserved peaches in the kitchen. "I hear tell they use touch itself as medicine, laying hands on the sick to draw out fever." "That sounds like superstition," Elizabeth replied, echoing her father's certain response, though something in the idea resonated deep within her. Martha's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Perhaps, or perhaps they understand something about healing that our modern ways have forgotten." When Reverend Caldwell finally succumbed to age and infirmity in Elizabeth's 30th year, it was Martha who closed his eyes, and Martha who held Elizabeth's hand at the small funeral, the first deliberate extended touch Elizabeth had experienced since childhood. The Reverend was laid to rest beside the wife he had lost 3 decades earlier, and Elizabeth returned to the silent house, now hers alone, with the wooden bird clutched in her palm and an unnamed yearning beating beneath her ribs like a second heart. The deed to the Caldwell farm felt impossibly heavy in Elizabeth's hands, a single sheet of parchment that represented both liberation and burden. With her father's passing, the property had come to her, the sole heir to a legacy of isolation. She traced her name on the document, the ink long dry, but the implications still fluid and uncertain. "You'll need help managing the place," Silas Morgan had told her the day after the funeral, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of the town's most prosperous banker. At 45, Silas was considered Copper Springs' most eligible widower, a distinction that seemed to matter little to anyone except Silas himself. "I've managed it alongside my father for years," Elizabeth had replied, her voice steady despite the unfamiliar territory of speaking for herself. Silas had smiled indulgently, as one might at a child's fanciful notion. The financial aspects, Miss Caldwell, taxes, loans, harvest calculations, these are men's concerns. Elizabeth had been surprised by the surge of resentment his words provoked. The Reverend had taught her figures and accounts out of necessity. His pride would not permit outsiders to know their business. She knew precisely how much the farm yielded, what it owed, and what it required. What she had not anticipated was the subtle resistance she would face as a woman alone. The merchants who had dealt respectfully with her father now quoted her higher prices. The seasonal workers arrived late and left early. The townspeople watched her with a mixture of pity and speculation, as though taking bets on how quickly she would fail. Martha had stayed on briefly after the Reverend's passing, but rheumatism in her joints soon forced her to move in with her daughter's family in Tucson. Her departure left Elizabeth truly alone for the first time, the silence of the house no longer punctuated by even the small sounds of another human presence. In that silence, Elizabeth found herself developing new habits. She began to speak aloud, her voice echoing strangely in rooms that had demanded whispers for decades. She moved furniture, creating spaces where the austere geometry of her father's preferences had once ruled. She took to sleeping in different rooms, trying to find one that felt like it might belong to her rather than to the ghost of the Reverend's authority. At night, she practiced touching her own face, her shoulders, her hands, trying to accustom herself to the sensation of human contact. Sometimes she would stand before the small mirror in what had been her father's study, watching as she reached out to meet her own reflection, fingers connecting with cold glass instead of warm flesh. Winter came early that year, with bitter winds that found every gap in the farmhouse's aging walls. The harvest had been poor, drought had stunted the crops, and Elizabeth lacked the manpower to salvage what remained. When snow began to dust the surrounding hills, she counted her dwindling supplies and calculated how long she might sustain herself before necessity drove her to town. It was during the first heavy snowfall that Silas Morgan rode up to her door, his horse leaving deep tracks in the fresh white blanket covering the yard. He removed his hat as she opened the door, but did not wait for an invitation before stepping into the house, the first man besides her father to cross that threshold in Elizabeth's memory. "I've come with a proposition," he announced, surveying the room with the appraising eye of a man already measuring for new curtains. "A business arrangement, if you will." Elizabeth stood with her arms wrapped around herself, maintaining the distance that habit had ingrained. "What sort of arrangement?" "Marriage," he said simply, as though proposing the purchase of a parcel of land. "You need a husband. This farm needs a man's hand, and I've been looking to expand my holdings in this direction." The word holdings lingered in the air between them, clarifying his interest more precisely than any declaration of affection might have done. Elizabeth felt something cold settle in her stomach, a dread that had nothing to do with the winter. Chill seeping through the floorboards. "I don't need a husband," she said, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "And this farm isn't for sale, not to you or anyone." Silas's smile tightened at the corners. "Be reasonable, Miss Caldwell. You're alone, approaching an age where prospects grow dim. I'm offering security, respectability. The bank holds your mortgage. Surely you understand the precariousness of your situation." The storm announced itself with a banshee wail that rattled the windows of the Caldwell farmhouse. Elizabeth moved methodically through the rooms, securing shutters and stoking the fire in the kitchen hearth. Outside, the first heavy flakes of snow spiraled down from a sky the color of bruised flesh. Silas Morgan had left with a warning rather than a farewell. "Think on my offer, Miss Caldwell. When the bank forecloses, you'll have nowhere to go, no family, no friends to take you in. A woman alone has few options in this territory." His words lingered like frost on the window panes, impossible to ignore yet painful to acknowledge. Elizabeth had spent her life in solitude, but there was a vast difference between solitude within the safety of familiar walls and the prospect of true homelessness. As she checked her supplies, a meager stack of firewood, flour and salt pork, sufficient for perhaps 2 weeks. A loose floorboard in the kitchen caught her attention. It had always creaked when stepped upon, but tonight it seemed more pronounced, as though the coming storm had somehow altered the very bones of the house. Kneeling, Elizabeth worked her fingers around the edge of the board. It lifted with surprising ease, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in faded calico. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a letter in unfamiliar handwriting and a simple gold wedding band. The letter was dated 3 days before her birth, addressed to "My dearest child. My precious one, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I fear my Josiah has kept his word about raising you in the ways of his newfound piety. Before his conversion, your father was a different man, one who laughed easily and held me as though I were the most precious thing in God's creation. The fever that nearly took him last winter left him changed, convinced that our physical affection was somehow sinful in the eyes of the Lord. I write this from my bed, where the doctor says I must remain until your birth. There are complications he cannot explain, and Josiah takes this as further evidence of divine judgment. He has sworn that should I not survive, he will raise you free from the corruption of the flesh that he believes has cursed our family. Know this, my child, I have loved you from the moment I felt your first fluttering movement within me. If I could have but one wish granted, it would be to hold you in my arms, even if only once. To feel your small heart beating against mine, to know that perfect love that exists between mother and child. Whatever your father may teach you, remember that God is love, and love expresses itself in touch as surely as in prayer. There is no sin in seeking comfort in the embrace of those who care for you. With all the love a mother's heart can hold, Margaret Caldwell, Elizabeth read the letter 3 times, each word burning itself into her memory. The paper grew damp with tears she hadn't realized were falling. All these years, she had believed her isolation was divine will, a necessary penance for her mother's death. To discover it was merely the twisted grief of a broken man, a choice, not a commandment, sent cracks splintering through the foundation of her understanding. She slipped the ring onto her finger, this tangible connection to the mother she had never known. It fit as though made for her hand, this small circle of gold that represented the love her father had denied them both. The wind howled louder, rattling the doors on their hinges like some wild thing demanding entry. Elizabeth rose, Letta clutched to her chest and moved to the window. Through the swirling snow, she could just make out the dim lights of Copper Springs in the valley below, and beyond that, the dark smudge of mountains where the Apache made their winter camps. In that moment, something shifted inside her, a breaking, yes, but also a clearing away. 30 years of obedience to a lie. 30 years of hunger for a touch that should have been her birthright. She would not give this farm to Silas Morgan. Neither would she remain in this house, haunted by the ghost of her father's fear. There was a third path, one that required only the courage to step beyond the boundaries that had confined her for so long. Elizabeth gathered her mother's letter, the wooden bird from the trading post, and what few supplies she could carry. The storm raged outside, promising certain danger to anyone foolish enough to venture into its fury. But for the first time in her life, the prospect of danger seemed less terrifying than that of remaining unchanged, untouched, unloved for one day more. Shii moved through the storm like a shadow, his moccasins finding purchase on the snow-covered ground where others might slip. He had not intended to venture this far from his winter shelter, but the small deer he tracked had led him on a winding path through the canyon lands. The meat would feed his sister's children for days, worth the risk of the blizzard that now enveloped the world in white silence. The Apache hunter paused, sensing a change in the wind's voice. Through the curtain of snow, he caught a flicker of movement that was neither animal nor swaying branch. Drawing closer, he distinguished a human form collapsed in the deepening snow of the arroyo, nearly buried by the relentless storm. A woman, a white woman. The realization should have been enough to turn him away. His people had learned the painful lesson that involvement with settlers rarely ended well for the Apache. Yet something kept him rooted in place. Perhaps the strange vulnerability of her position, or the soft sound that escaped her lips as she struggled to rise and fell again. Memories stirred of another time, another storm, when he had been the one fallen in the snow. His grandfather had taught him that all lives were connected in ways beyond understanding. The moment you turn from suffering, you can prevent, the old man had said. You diminish your own spirit. Shii approached, cautiously. The woman's eyes fluttered open at his footsteps, revealing irises the color of the summer sky. Fear flickered across her features, followed by resignation, as though she had expected death, but not in this form. "I won't hurt you," he said in English, one of the few phrases he had mastered in the language of the settlers. He wasn't certain. She could hear him over the wind's howl. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't understand. She was poorly dressed for the storm, a woolen dress and thin shawl, both already crusted with ice. Her hands, bare to the elements, had taken on an alarming bluish tint. Without allowing himself to consider the consequences, Shii unwound the tattered blanket from his shoulders. It was his only protection against the cold, besides his buckskin shirt, but the woman's need was clearly greater. He draped it over her, tucking the edges around her shoulders as gently as his calloused hands allowed. The woman's eyes widened at his touch, a strange mixture of terror and wonder crossing her face. Shii had seen such expressions before, usually on wild creatures unexpectedly cornered. He drew back slightly, giving her space despite the storm's urgency. "Shelter," he said, pointing toward the distant cliffs where his temporary camp was situated. "Come." He extended his hand, palm up, in the universal gesture of offering assistance. She stared at his outstretched hand as if it were some mysterious artifact, incomprehensible yet compelling. When she finally reached toward him, her movements were hesitant, almost reverent. Their fingers met and she flinched as though the contact burned, yet she did not pull away. Her hand in his was like ice. She enclosed it between both of his, trying to transfer some warmth into her frozen fingers. A small sound escaped her, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, and for a moment he feared he had somehow hurt her. But then, her other hand, came up to rest atop his, creating a strange layering of touch that seemed to hold significance beyond his understanding. "My name is Elizabeth," she said, the words barely audible above the storm. "She," he replied, tapping his chest. She tried to repeat it, her tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. He smiled despite the gravity of their situation, and after a moment's hesitation she smiled too, a fragile thing, like the first crocus pushing through snow. The storm was intensifying. They needed to move before the trails became impassable, even to one who knew them well. Shi helped Elizabeth to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. She was taller than the women of his tribe, her frame thin but strong. When she took a step, however, she crumpled with a cry of pain. Her ankle, he realized, must have been injured in her fall. Without asking permission, there was no time for such niceties. With the temperature dropping rapidly, Shi swept her into his arms. She went rigid at first, every muscle tense, as though preparing to fight or flee. Then, as he began to walk, she gradually relaxed against his chest, her head coming to rest in the hollow of his shoulder. It was a position of complete trust from a woman who, moments before, had looked at him with fear. Shi found himself moving with unusual care, as though carrying not just a stranger, but something infinitely precious and easily broken. The shelter was tucked into the side of the canyon, a natural alcove that Shi had improved, with a framework of juniper branches and hides. It was modest compared to the Caldwell farmhouse, but as he ducked through the low entrance with Elizabeth still cradled in his arms, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the small fire, smouldering in a ring of stones at its center. "Here," Shi said, gently lowering her onto a bed of pine boughs covered with rabbit furs. Elizabeth's body protested as he moved away, missing the solidity of his presence, the first extended human contact she could remember experiencing. The shelter was sparse, but thoughtfully arranged. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling. A stack of firewood lined one wall. Various tools and weapons were neatly stored in a deerskin bag. A stone bowl sat near the fire, its contents emitting a fragrant steam that filled the small space. Shi knelt by the fire, adding branches that caught quickly, sending shadows dancing across the walls. In the flickering light, Elizabeth studied her rescuer. He was not young, perhaps 40, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. His black hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was tied back with a simple leather cord. His hands, as they moved with practiced efficiency, bore the scars and calluses of a life lived close to the elements. When he turned toward her again, she found herself instinctively drawing back, pressing against the wall of the shelter. A lifetime of conditioning could not be overcome in a single moment, no matter how transformative. "Hurt?" he asked, gesturing toward her ankle. Elizabeth nodded, extending her foot slightly. She moved toward her, then paused, seeming to sense her apprehension. He pointed to her ankle, then to himself, raising his eyebrows in question. She understood he was asking permission to examine her injury. The concept was so foreign. Her father had never asked before imposing his will, that for a moment she simply stared at him in confusion. Then hesitantly, she nodded again. His touch was gentle as he removed her sodden boot and torn stocking. His fingers probed carefully around her ankle, which had already begun to swell. Elizabeth bit her lip, fighting the dual sensations of pain from the injury and an almost electrical awareness of his skin against hers. She released her foot and moved to the stone bowl by the fire. He dipped a cloth into the steaming liquid, wrung it out, and returned to her side. Again he waited, catching her eye before proceeding. The warm compress against her swollen ankle brought immediate relief. Elizabeth sighed, some of the tension leaving her body. She nodded in approval and began to prepare a poultice from the herbs hanging above. He worked methodically, grinding leaves and roots in a smaller stone mortar, adding drops of what looked like pine resin. The familiar actions seemed to put him at ease, and as his initial wariness faded, so too did some of Elizabeth's fear. "Storm," he said, gesturing toward the entrance where snow continued to fall heavily. "Stay. 2, 3 days." The implication was clear. They were trapped, together in this small space until the blizzard passed. Under normal circumstances, the prospect of such close quarters with a stranger, particularly a man, would have terrified Elizabeth. Yet she found herself more curious than afraid, as though her escape from the farmhouse had somehow freed her from more than just its physical confines. She offered her a wooden cup filled with a dark liquid. When she hesitated, he took a small sip himself before extending it to her again. The gesture was not lost on Elizabeth. He was proving it was safe, establishing trust in the most basic way. The tea was bitter but not unpleasant, with undertones of mint and something earthier. As warmth spread through her body, the pain in her ankle dulled to a manageable ache. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for what he had done. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her gratitude. Then he pointed now to her clothes, still damp from the snow, and made a motion like shivering. Elizabeth understood. She needed dry garments, but the prospect of disrobing, even partially, in the presence of another person sent a wave of panic through her. Sensing her distress, he turned his back and busied himself with laying out the deer he had hunted, giving her privacy within the confines of the small shelter. Among his few possessions was a buckskin shirt, which he placed beside her. Without looking, Elizabeth changed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold and the unfamiliar intimacy of the situation. The shirt was large on her frame, but softer than she had expected, carrying the scent of smoke and pine and something distinctly human. Dawn broke without sunlight, the storm still howling beyond the shelter's entrance. Elizabeth woke to find she already moving about the small space, feeding the fire and preparing what appeared to be a breakfast of dried meat and some kind of seed porridge. She had slept more soundly than she could remember, the exhaustion of her ordeal and the strange security of another's presence combining to grant her unusual rest. When he noticed she was awake, she made a gesture, like drinking. Elizabeth nodded, and he brought her another cup of the medicinal tea. This time their fingers brushed during the exchange. She didn't flinch away, a small victory that seemed to please him. "Better?" he asked, gesturing to her ankle. Elizabeth carefully flexed her foot. The swelling had subsided considerably, though tenderness remained. "Yes, better." Their shared vocabulary was limited, his English consisting of perhaps 24 words, her knowledge of Apache non-existent. Yet over the morning hours, they began to develop a language of their own. She would touch an object, name it in Apache, then look expectantly at Elizabeth until she provided the English equivalent. They accumulated words: fire, ko; water, tu; stone, say; blanket, bichahi. After their simple meal, she retrieved a smooth, flat stone from his belongings. Using a piece of charcoal from the fire's edge, he began to draw. First, a simple figure of a man, then a woman. He pointed to himself, then the male figure, then to Elizabeth and the female drawing. Understanding his intent, Elizabeth took the charcoal from his outstretched hand. Their fingers connected again, and this time she allowed them to linger, curious about the rough texture of his skin against hers. When she finally pulled away to add to the drawing, she caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Not quite a smile, but a softening. She drew a simple house, then a rough approximation of the canyon and shelter. Through pictures and gestures, they exchanged the basic outlines of their lives. Elizabeth showed how she had left her home, walked through the storm, and fallen in the arroyo. She illustrated his hunting trip, finding her and bringing her to safety. When Elizabeth drew a small family grouping, then crossed out the mother figure and drew herself standing apart from her father, she nodded with unexpected understanding. He drew his own family group, then created a barrier between himself and the others. Outcast? Elizabeth asked, the word emerging before she'd considered whether he would understand. He tilted his head, considering. Yes, he said finally. Outcast. It was the first personal revelation that went beyond the immediate necessities of their situation. Elizabeth wanted to know more, but lacked the means to ask complex questions. Instead, she reached out hesitantly and touched the back of his hand where it rested on the stone. The gesture seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. For a moment, neither moved, caught in the simple yet profound connection of skin against skin. Then Shi turned his hand over so that their palms met. It was nothing like the aggressive handshakes she had observed among the men in Copper Springs. This was a gentle pressure, an acknowledgement of presence. In my tribe, he said slowly, clearly working to find the right English words, hands speak, heal. He moved his free hand in a flowing motion over her injured ankle without touching it. Medicine, not just plants. Medicine here. He touched his palm to his chest, then gently to her shoulder. Elizabeth thought of her mother's letter. Love expresses itself in touch as surely as in prayer, and felt a tightness in her throat. That afternoon, while the storm continued unabated, she began teaching Elizabeth more deliberate signs, the hand language his people used when silence was necessary during hunts or when speaking across distances. Simple concepts at first: water, food, cold, warm, yes, no, thank you. Each sign required Elizabeth to move her hands in ways that felt foreign, yet strangely liberating, as though she were finding her voice through her fingers after a lifetime of forced silence. By evening, when she prepared their small dinner, Elizabeth found herself reaching for the wooden cup without hesitation when he offered it. The distance between them, physical and otherwise, had diminished hour by hour through this new language they were creating together. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind's voice rose to a crescendo outside, Elizabeth dreamed of hands. Her mother's, which she had never known, her father's, always kept at a distance, and now she's, which were teaching her that touch could be a bridge rather than a barrier. On the third day, the storm finally began to subside. The howling, wind quieted to an occasional whisper, and the constant curtain of snow thinned to sporadic flurries. Inside the shelter, Elizabeth and she had established a rhythm to their coexistence, their initial wariness replaced by a tentative comfort. That evening, as they shared a meal of rabbit stew, she had ventured out briefly to check his snares. He produced a small leather pouch from his belongings. Inside were a dozen slender sticks, each etched with intricate patterns. He arranged them carefully on the ground between them, then looked up at Elizabeth with a question. In his eyes, what are they? She asked, gesturing toward the sticks. She picked up one stick and ran his finger along the notches carved into its surface. Stories, he said. Count days, moons, remember. He began a rhythmic tapping with one of the sticks against his palm, creating a soft percussion that filled the shelter. Then, his voice low and melodic, he began to speak in Apache. Though Elizabeth couldn't understand the words, the cadence carried her along like a current. At certain points, he would pause the tapping and use the stick to point at different marks, as though they were specific references in a written text. Elizabeth watched, transfixed by this form of storytelling so different from her father's severe Bible readings. She's whole body participated, his face animated, hands flowing through occasional sign language to illustrate concepts. When he finished, he placed the first stick down and picked up another, raising his eyebrows at Elizabeth. Please, she said, nodding. This story seemed different. There were sounds like animal calls, moments when she hunched his shoulders and prowled in place. Elizabeth found herself smiling at his portrayal of what she guessed was a coyote or wolf. When he made a particularly comic expression of animal confusion, a laugh escaped her, a sound so unfamiliar to her own ears that she immediately covered her mouth in surprise. She stopped, his eyes widening slightly. Then his face broke into the first full smile she had seen from him. He gestured for her to remove her hand from her mouth, then made the comic expression again, clearly hoping to repeat the effect. Elizabeth laughed more freely this time, the sound filling the small space. Shi joined her, his deeper chuckle, harmonizing with hers. It was such a simple moment, two people sharing amusement over a story, yet to Elizabeth, it felt like discovering a new country. When their laughter subsided, a comfortable silence settled between them. Shi arranged his story sticks back into their pouch, then hesitated before speaking again. "My name," he said, touching his chest, "means he who embraces, in your words." He made a gesture of arms encircling something precious. "Not for—" He searched for the word. "Not for woman holding, for—" He frowned, struggling to explain. "For what?" Elizabeth asked gently. Shi considered, then reached out slowly and took her hand. He placed it palm down on the earth floor of the shelter. "All things connected," he said. "The rocks, trees, animals, people. Apache way is to embrace all, hold in respect." He released her hand but kept his own next to hers on the ground. "My grandfather gave name, said I see connections others miss." Elizabeth thought about this concept, so at odds with her father's teachings about separation and purity, yet somehow resonating with her mother's words about love expressed through touch. "It's a good name," she said. Shi nodded, then looked at her questioningly. "Your stories?" he asked. Elizabeth hesitated. Her life had been defined by silence and limitation. What stories did she have to tell? Yet as she considered the question, she realized her very absence of experience was itself a story worth sharing. Slowly, using their combination of simple English, drawings, and the signs he had taught her, Elizabeth began to tell him about growing up in the Caldwell house, about a father who believed physical contact was sinful, about watching other children embrace their parents while she stood apart, about teaching herself to find warmth in solitude. As she spoke, she listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard for perhaps the first time in her life. When she faltered, uncertain how to convey complex emotions with limited language, he would wait patiently, never rushing to fill the silence. When she finished, he picked up one of his story sticks and held it out to her. "Your story now here too," he said simply. "Not forgotten." With the storms passing, a pristine stillness settled over the canyon. The world outside the shelter lay transformed under a blanket of white that softened every hard edge. Elizabeth's ankle had healed enough for her to stand, though she still moved with a careful limp that she watched with concerned eyes. "Need more wood," he said on the fourth morning, gesturing to their dwindling supply. The days of confinement had depleted his careful stockpile. "You stay, rest." Elizabeth shook her head. "I'll help," she insisted, reaching for the buckskin jacket he had lent her. After days in the small shelter, she longed for fresh air, regardless of the cold. She studied her for a moment, then nodded. He fashioned a walking stick from a slender branch, testing its strength before handing it to her. The consideration behind the gesture, the way he anticipated her needs without making her feel weak, stirred something in Elizabeth that she couldn't quite name. Outside, the snow reached midway up her calves, making each step an effort. They moved slowly down a game trail that wound through stands of juniper and pine. The silence was absolute, except for the soft crunch of their footsteps and the occasional whisper of snow falling from overburdened branches. Elizabeth found herself pausing often, not just to rest her ankle, but to absorb the breathtaking beauty around her. The crystalline quality of the air, the way sunlight fractured into rainbows against ice-coated twigs, the sharp scent of pine. It was as though she was seeing the world with new eyes. She had lived her entire life in this territory, yet had never truly looked at it this way. Her father had taught her to view nature as something to be tamed and subdued, not celebrated. Watching Shi move through the landscape, the reverent way he touched tree trunks and nodded at animal tracks, she glimpsed a different relationship with the natural world. They had gathered several armfuls of fallen branches when Elizabeth spotted a larger log partially buried in snow. It would burn longer than the smaller pieces, providing valuable heat through the night. She leaned her walking stick against a tree and moved toward it without thinking. The snow concealed an icy rock beneath. Her foot slipped, and she felt herself falling before she could call out. Pain shot through her injured ankle as it twisted beneath her. A sharp cry escaped her lips, part surprise, part agony. In an instant, Shi was beside her, the gathered wood forgotten. His strong hands gripped her shoulders, steadying her before she could fully collapse. The sudden contact startled Elizabeth almost as much as the fall itself. Their bodies were close, his face near enough that she could see flecks of amber in his dark eyes. "Hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Elizabeth couldn't speak through the pain. Tears sprang to her eyes, blurring her vision. Without hesitation, Shi pulled her against his chest, one arm supporting her back while the other cradled her head. It was an instinctive gesture of comfort, the kind that humans have offered one another since time immemorial. For Elizabeth, it was revelation. Her body went rigid at first, every muscle tensing against this unknown sensation. Her heart raced wildly, her mind flooding with her father's warnings about the sinfulness of touch. Yet beneath those ingrained responses, something deeper and more primal responded to the simple human comfort being offered. Slowly, like ice yielding to spring warmth, she relaxed into the embrace. Her head came to rest against Shi's shoulder, her arms tentatively encircling his waist. She felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the rise and fall of his chest with each breath, the solid strength of arms that asked nothing but to support her in pain. They remained thus for what might have been moments or minutes. Time seemed suspended in the quiet forest. When Elizabeth finally drew back slightly to look up at him, tears had left frozen tracks on her cheeks. Shi brushed them away with a gentle thumb, his expression a mixture of concern and something deeper, more complex. "First embrace?" he asked softly. Elizabeth nodded, unable to find words for the tumult of emotions cascading through her. Joy and sorrow twined together. Joy at the discovery of this simple human connection. Sorrow for all the years she had been denied it. She seemed to understand, without explanation. He kept one arm around her shoulders as he helped her back to her feet, retrieving her walking stick with his free hand. When he offered it to her, she hesitated, reluctant, to surrender the support of his body for the impersonal aid of the branch. Sensing her reluctance, Shi smiled slightly. "Not last embrace," he said, the promise in his words warming her more thoroughly than any fire could have done. That evening, Elizabeth began a small journal using scraps of paper Shi had traded for at some point. With a piece of charcoal, she drew a simple outline of two figures standing close, arms around each other. Beneath it, she wrote a single word: today. The crunch of multiple horses' hooves on packed snow reached the shelter before voices did. Shi froze in the act of skinning a rabbit, his head tilting like a deer, catching a predator's scent. Elizabeth, who had been sorting dried herbs, by his instruction, saw his expression shift from concentration to wariness in an instant. "People," he said quietly, moving to the entrance and peering carefully through the narrow opening. "White men. Many." Elizabeth felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She joined him at the entrance, careful to stay hidden within the shadows. In the distance, a line of riders wound through the canyon, perhaps half a mile away, but moving in their general direction. Even at this distance, she recognized the broad-shouldered figure at the front, Silas Morgan, his distinctive black hat unmistakable against the snow. "They look for you," Shi said, his voice carefully neutral, though she caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. "Yes." Elizabeth's mind raced. Nearly a week had passed since she'd left the farmhouse. She hadn't considered that anyone would search for her, least of all with such determination. But of course Silas would, not out of concern for her welfare, but because he saw her as property to be claimed, much like the land he coveted. "They find us, bad for me," he said simply. "White woman, Apache man." He made a hanging gesture that required no further explanation. The injustice of it struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. This man who had saved her life, tended her injury, and shown her more kindness than she had known in 30 years, would be presumed guilty of abduction or worse, simply because of the color of his skin. The search party wouldn't believe she had come to the canyon willingly, nor that she had chosen to stay. "We hide," she whispered, gripping his arm. "Both of us." She hesitated, clearly weighing their options. The shelter was well concealed, built into a recess in the canyon wall and fronted with branches arranged to blend with the surrounding vegetation. But a thorough search would eventually discover it, along with the telltale signs of recent habitation. He nodded decisively and began gathering essential items: his knife, the remaining food, his precious story sticks. Elizabeth quickly rolled their shared blankets, securing them with a strip of leather. They worked in silent efficiency, communicating with glances and gestures that would have been impossible a week earlier. The voices grew clearer, men calling to each other, the metallic sound of a bridle, someone complaining about the cold. Shigi extinguished the small fire with snow, plunging the shelter into dimness. He motioned for Elizabeth to follow him toward the back wall, where he pushed aside what appeared to be solid rock, revealing a narrow crevice barely wide, enough for a person to squeeze through. "Old ways," he whispered, "for danger times." Elizabeth went first, the rough stones scraping her shoulders as she inched sideways into the hidden passage. She followed, pulling the false rock back into place behind them. The passage climbed, steeply upward, requiring them to feel their way in near-total darkness. After several minutes of careful ascent, the narrow tunnel opened onto a small ledge high on the canyon wall, concealed from below by an outcropping of rock. From this vantage point, they could see the search party clearly. 6 men on horseback, with Silas leading them straight toward the area where the shelter lay. As they watched, one of the riders pointed to something in the snow. Tracks, Elizabeth realized with a sinking feeling. Her ill-advised attempt to help gather firewood had left a trail leading directly back to their hiding place. Silas dismounted, handed his reins to another rider, and drew his pistol. The other men followed suit, spreading out in a practiced formation that suggested this wasn't their first manhunt. They moved with the confidence of those who considered themselves above the law, or perhaps more accurately, those who were the law in territories where official justice was spread thin. "Miss Caldwell," Silas's voice echoed against the canyon walls. "We know you're out here. Show yourself and no harm will come to you." Elizabeth felt Shii tense beside her. His hand found hers in the shadows, fingers intertwining with a gentle pressure that conveyed both reassurance and question. She squeezed back, her decision made without words. She would not call out. She would not return to a life without touch, without laughter, without the simple human connections she had only just discovered. As the search party neared the shelter, something glinted in the snow. Silas's silver pocket watch, fallen from his vest as he dismounted. A small thing, but it caught the winter sun like a signal, a reminder of the world she had left behind, a world measured in ticking seconds, property lines and rigid proprieties that had never truly been hers. The search party departed at dusk, having found the shelter but not its occupants. From their hidden perch, Elizabeth and Shii watched the men confer, gesturing angrily toward the evidence of recent habitation. Silas had stood in the center of the abandoned space, his face a mask of frustration as he examined the remnants of their simple life together. The stone medicine bowl, the bed of pine boughs, the charred remains of their morning fire. "Apache!" one of the men had spat, pointing to a pair of moccasin tracks preserved in a sheltered corner. "Took her for sure, probably heading back to the reservation. Or she's already dead," another had suggested, touching the dark stains on the rabbit fur, blood from Shee's hunting, but easily mistaken for something more sinister. Silas had silenced them with a sharp gesture. "We'll return tomorrow with more men. Search the entire canyon system. She's valuable property, and I intend to claim what's rightfully mine." Only when the riders had disappeared around the canyon bend did Shee and Elizabeth descend from their hiding place. The shelter felt violated, its peaceful atmosphere disrupted by the intrusion of hostile strangers. Elizabeth moved through the space, straightening what had been disturbed, while Shee secured the entrance more thoroughly. "They come back," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Tomorrow, more men." Elizabeth nodded, accepting this reality. The temporary sanctuary they had found was no longer safe. "Where will we go?" she asked, the question encompassing more than just their immediate destination. Shee was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable in the fading light. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "My people, West Mountains. Spring camp soon." He hesitated, then added, "Dangerous for you, different ways." "More dangerous than here?" Elizabeth gestured toward the canyon entrance where Silas and his men had disappeared. A small smile touched Shee's lips. "Different danger." As night fell, they sat close beside a carefully shielded fire, sharing the last of their dried meat. A map lay between them, a crude but effective rendering of the territory that Shee had drawn on a piece of tanned hide. He indicated their current position, then traced a route through the mountains toward a valley where his tribe made their spring camp. 3-4 days walking, he explained. Snow deep still. Hard journey. Elizabeth studied the map, noting how far the indicated location was from any white settlement. "Will your people accept me?" she asked, the question that had been foremost in her mind since he first mentioned returning to his tribe. Shee did not offer false reassurance. "Not no," he admitted. "I am—" He searched for the word outside, not trusted always. His finger tapped the mark representing the tribal camp. "But old ones, they listen, see truth. And if they don't accept us?" Elizabeth pressed. Shee met her gaze steadily. "Then we find another way, together." The simplicity of his statement, the certainty that their paths were now joined, regardless of what lay ahead, filled Elizabeth with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She reached for his hand, the gesture becoming more natural with each passing day. "I need to tell you," she said, "about my farm, about Silas." The words came haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency as she explained the banker's designs on her property, his unwelcome proposal, and the threats that had driven her into the storm. "He won't stop looking," she concluded. "Not until he has the land." Shee listened intently, his thumb moving in small circles against her palm as she spoke. When she finished, he nodded as though her story had confirmed something he already suspected. "Men like him," he said, "same everywhere. Want more? Always more?" His expression darkened momentarily. "My father died fighting such men." It was the most he had revealed about his past, this small window into the losses that had shaped him. Elizabeth waited, sensing there was more he wished to say. "I fought too," he continued after a long silence. "Many seasons. Then—" He made a gesture like something breaking. "Saw too much death. Chose different way." His eyes found hers in the firelight. Peace way, healing way. Elizabeth understood then why he was separate from his tribe, not exiled perhaps, but set apart by choices that went against the warrior tradition. A man who had embraced life in a time of death, a healer in a season of wounding. As the fire burned down to embers, they made their preparations for departure. The few possessions they would carry were bundled efficiently. What couldn't be taken was carefully hidden or returned to the earth, leaving minimal trace of their presence. Before they slept, Elizabeth added a new entry to her growing journal. Beneath her earlier drawing of their first embrace, she sketched a simple pathway leading through mountains, two figures walking side by side, not yet knowing their destination, but certain of their direction. Forward, together. They traveled under moonlight, keeping to the shadows of the canyon walls. By dawn, they had put several miles between themselves and the abandoned shelter. Elizabeth moved with newfound strength, her body adapting to the demands of their journey in ways that surprised her. A lifetime of farm labor had built endurance, if not wilderness skills. "Need supplies," she said as they paused to rest. "Food, warmer clothes for you." Elizabeth nodded, understanding his concern. The path to the tribal camp would take them through higher elevations, where the temperature would drop considerably. Her borrowed buckskins provided inadequate protection against such cold. "The farm," she said after a moment's consideration. "My farm has what we need." She looked at her with concern. "Dangerous. Men look there too." "They've already searched it," Elizabeth reasoned, "and they'll be focusing on the canyons, now not watching the farm. We can approach after dark, gather supplies, and be gone before morning." Though clearly hesitant, she acknowledged the logic of her plan. They adjusted their course, moving through less direct but more concealed routes toward the Caldwell property. As the day progressed, the terrain became more familiar to Elizabeth, stirring complicated emotions. This land had been both her prison and her sanctuary, the only home she had ever known. They reached the edge of the property shortly after nightfall. From their vantage point in a stand of juniper, they could see the farmhouse standing dark and empty, its windows like blind eyes staring into the night. But there was something different about the place, subtle changes that registered as wrong to Elizabeth's knowing gaze. "Someone's been here," she whispered. A new hitching post stood near the barn, and fresh-cut firewood was stacked against the south wall, arrangements her father would never have permitted and that she herself had not made. She nodded, his eyes scanning the property for signs of current occupation. "Empty now," he concluded after several minutes of observation, "but used recent." They approached cautiously, moving from shadow to shadow across the yard. Elizabeth led them not to the main door, but to the root cellar entrance at the rear of the house. It had a separate key that she had kept hidden beneath a particular stone in the garden wall, a small rebellion. Having access her father didn't. Monitor. Inside, the cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and preserved foods. Elizabeth gathered supplies by touch, dried apples, salt pork, beans, and cornmeal, while she kept watch at the narrow cellar doors. When her sack was full, they moved silently up the interior stairs into the kitchen. The wrongness was more pronounced inside. Small items had been moved or replaced, a different kettle hung by the fireplace. New curtains, garish compared to her father's austere tastes, covered the windows. "Silas," Elizabeth breathed, anger flaring inside her. "He's already claiming the place." She moved through the house with determined steps, no longer concerned with stealth. In her father's study, drawers had been rifled through, papers scattered. The Reverend's Bible lay open on the desk, pages marked with unfamiliar notations. Drawn by some instinct she couldn't name, Elizabeth picked up the heavy book. As she did, something clattered to the floor from between its pages, a small key she had never seen before. Beside it lay a folded paper that had apparently been used as a bookmark. She opened it to find a crude map of the farm with certain boundaries marked in red ink, boundaries that extended well beyond the Caldwell property line into neighboring lands. "What is this?" she murmured, showing the map to He studied it briefly. "Taking more land," he said, his expression darkening. "Your land, then others." The key, Elizabeth discovered, fit a small compartment hidden in the base of her father's bookshelf, a secret space she had never known existed. Inside lay a packet of letters bound with faded ribbon, a marriage certificate, and a small velvet pouch containing her mother's wedding ring. With trembling fingers, Elizabeth slipped the ring onto her finger beside her mother's band. A perfect match. Two halves of a pair separated for decades. She opened one of the letters at random, recognizing her father's handwriting, though the tone was unlike anything she had ever associated with the stern Reverend. "My beloved Margaret, the valley is in full bloom, just as you said it would be. I've chosen the site for our home, on the rise overlooking the creek, where the wildflowers carpet the ground in spring. I can picture you there already, your hair catching the morning light as you gather herbs for your remedies. The locals speak highly of your parents' healing work. Your father's notes on native plant uses have already proven invaluable to the settlement. I count the days until you can join me. The mission board has approved our marriage, though they still question the wisdom of incorporating indigenous practices into our medical work. They do not understand, as you have shown me, that God's healing grace manifests in many forms, through many traditions. All my love, Josiah." Elizabeth stared at the letter, struggling to reconcile this passionate, open-minded young pastor with the cold, rigid man who had raised her. It was as though she were reading about a stranger, or perhaps the man her father might have been, before grief transformed him into someone unrecognizable. The sound of approaching horses shattered the stillness of the night. Elizabeth hastily gathered the letters, stuffing them into her pack alongside the other supplies. Shi was already at the window, his body tense as he peered through. "A gap in the curtains. Many riders," he reported, voice low. "Torches." Elizabeth joined him, her heart sinking as she recognized Silas at the head of what appeared to be a formal posse, at least a dozen men, some wearing deputy badges that gleamed in the torchlight. This was no longer a private search party, but an official manhunt. "He's turned this into a criminal matter," she whispered, "made them believe I've been abducted." There was no time for further discussion. They slipped out through the back door just as the riders entered the front yard. Keeping to the shadows of the orchard, they made their way toward the eastern boundary of the property, where the terrain grew rocky and would better hide their tracks. Behind them, Silas's voice rang out, issuing orders with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. "Check every room. She might be held captive. And watch yourselves. That Apache savage could be anywhere." Elizabeth felt Shiwi stiffen beside her at the slur, though his expression remained impassive. They continued moving in silence, until they reached a small outcropping that offered momentary shelter and a vantage point of the farm below. The posse had spread out, methodically searching the house and outbuildings, lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. "We need to keep moving," Elizabeth urged. "They'll search the property boundaries next." Shi nodded, but before rising he reached into the front of his shirt and withdrew something she hadn't seen before. An eagle feather, its surface adorned with intricate beadwork and wrapped at the base with dyed sinew. "Your warrior." "A token?" Elizabeth asked, recognizing its significance from stories Martha had sometimes shared about native customs. "Yes." His fingers traced the beadwork almost reverently. "Many years not touch, now need strength." The simple admission revealed volumes about the man beside her, that he had not only been a warrior, but one of some standing among his people, that he had deliberately set aside that identity to follow a path of healing, that now, for her sake, he was reconnecting with the strength of his former self. As they resumed their journey, moving deeper into increasingly rugged terrain, Shi began to share more of his story. His words came haltingly at first, then with growing fluency as he found the English to express complex ideas. He had been a respected warrior in his youth, leading successful raids against encroaching settlers and rival tribes. But a particular battle had changed him. A surprise attack on a homestead that was supposed to house soldiers, but instead contained only a family with young children. Though no innocents were harmed under his command, the incident had awakened something in him, a recognition of the cyclical nature of violence and revenge. "I see children eyes," he explained. Fear, same as Apache children when soldiers come. Same fear, different faces. I think then, this path no end. Against the wishes of many in his tribe, he had begun studying with a renowned medicine man, learning the healing arts traditionally reserved for those who had received specific visions or signs. His choice had cost him status and the respect of fellow warriors, though the tribal elders had eventually recognized his gift for healing. Not exile, he clarified, but not same place as before. Between worlds now. Elizabeth understood this liminal existence all too well, to be physically present within a community, yet fundamentally separate from it. It was how she had lived her entire life in Copper Springs, always the strange Caldwell girl, marked by her father's rigid beliefs and her own enforced isolation. By dawn, they had covered several miles of difficult terrain, following game trails that wound through steep ravines. Elizabeth's farm clothes, exchanged for her borrowed buckskins, provided better protection against the morning chill, and the supplies weighed comfortably in her pack. Still, fatigue pulled at her limbs, and she knew she must be equally exhausted. When they paused to rest beside a small spring, she produced a piece of jerky from his pouch, tearing it in half to share. As Elizabeth reached for her portion, she noticed him suddenly alert, head tilted toward the wind. "Riders," he said, the single word heavy with implication. "Following our trail." "How is that possible?" Elizabeth asked. "We've been so careful." She pointed to a distinctive formation on the horizon. "Only one path through those stones. Tracker know this." His expression grew somber. "Man with posse, one with red scarf. I know him. Santiago, best tracker in territory, hunt Apache for army before." Fear coiled in Elizabeth's stomach. A professional tracker changed everything, transforming their flight from a desperate gamble to a methodical pursuit where experience favored their hunters. She saw in Shi's eyes that he was making the same calculation. "We won't outrun them," she said, giving voice to the reality they both recognized. "No," he agreed, "but can outthink them." He studied the terrain ahead, his gaze settling on the distant mountains shrouded in morning mist. Need to separate, create false trails. Elizabeth's fever began on the second day of their separation. What started as a mild chill intensified into violent shivering that no amount of exertion could dispel. By the time she reached their designated meeting point, a distinctive three-pronged rock formation overlooking a narrow valley, her vision was blurring, and each step required conscious effort. She found her there, slumped against the base of the rocks. His face, normally so composed, registered alarm as he touched her forehead. "Sick," he said, the single word carrying layers of concern. "Need shelter, medicine." They had successfully confused their pursuers with multiple false trails, but the effort had cost them time and energy they couldn't spare. Elizabeth's illness further complicated their journey to the Apache camp, now at least 2 days away across increasingly difficult terrain. She constructed a makeshift shelter in a protected hollow, gathering pine boughs to create both bedding and cover. His movements were efficient but gentle as he helped Elizabeth lie down, her body now alternating between burning heat and bone-deep chills. "Sleep," he urged, covering her with both their blankets. "I find medicine plants." Through the haze of fever, Elizabeth watched him collect his knife and empty pouch. His hand lingered briefly on her shoulder, a touch that conveyed more than words could have done, before he slipped away into the gathering dusk. Her dreams were vivid and disjointed, her father reading from his Bible, but the words transforming into her mother's handwriting. Silas Morgan measuring the farmhouse with a silver chain that grew longer with each step. Shi's hands crafting something she couldn't quite see, but knew was important. She woke to voices, men's voices, harsh and triumphant. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. Then rough hands pulled her from the shelter, and she found herself staring into Silas Morgan's cold eyes. "Well, well," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. The prodigal daughter returned from her savage adventure. Elizabeth tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her thoughts scattered by fever. Around them stood 5 men from the posse, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust as they took in her appearance, dressed in a mixture of settler and native clothing, her hair loose and tangled, her skin bronzed from days in the open air. "Where is he?" Silas demanded, his fingers digging painfully into her arm. "Where's the Apache?" "Gone," Elizabeth managed, grateful that Shii had not been captured. "Long gone." "Liar," Silas spat. "Santiago says the tracks are fresh. He's nearby." He turned to the others. "Search the area. He can't have gone far." As the men spread out, Silas pulled Elizabeth to her feet. The world tilted alarmingly, but she forced herself to stand, knowing that any display of weakness would only strengthen his position. "I've got the deed now, you know," he said conversationally, as though discussing a business transaction rather than theft. "Signed over to me by the county in your absence. Declared dead or missing, legal and proper." From his vest pocket, he produced a folded document, waving it before her with the smugness of a man who believes he holds all the cards. "Your precious farm is mine, but I'm a reasonable man, Elizabeth. Come back with me now. Agree to my proposal, and you can still live in your family home, as Mrs. Morgan, of course." The fever seemed to burn away any last vestiges of fear Elizabeth might have felt. In its place rose a clarity and courage that straightened her spine despite her physical weakness. "That farm was never what I valued, Silas," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "You're welcome to the land and the house. They're just things." Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by anger. "Don't be a fool. What else do you have? Where else would you go?" "I have found what truly matters," Elizabeth said, thinking of Shii's gentle hands, his patient teachings, the warmth of human connection she had discovered in his embrace. "And it's something you could never understand." Silas's face darkened. "The savage?" he sneered. "You've let an Apache touch you? What would your father say?" "My father," Elizabeth replied with sudden insight, "was once a man who recognized wisdom and healing in other traditions before grief twisted him into someone he was not. I have his letters now, Silas. I know the truth." Uncertainty crossed his features for the first time. "What letters?" Before she could answer, a commotion erupted from the trees. 2 of the posse members returned, dragging Shii between them. His face was bloodied, one eye swelling shut, but his back remained straight, his dignity intact even in captivity. Elizabeth moved toward him instinctively, but Silas jerked her back. "So this is your choice?" he demanded, disgust evident in every syllable. This savage over civilization?" "This man," Elizabeth corrected, meeting Shii's gaze with unwavering certainty, "saved my life when he could have left me, to die. He showed me kindness when he had every reason to show bitterness. He taught me that touch can heal rather than harm." She stepped deliberately away from Silas, moving to stand beside Shii. "Yes, this is my choice." For a moment no one moved. Then Silas raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at Shii's chest. "I think not, Miss Caldwell. Apache raiders killed 3 settlers last month. The territory has a bounty on renegades. I'd say we've caught ourselves a murderer." The arrow struck the ground mere inches from Silas's boot, a warning shot executed with deliberate precision. Everyone froze, gazes shifting to the ridge above where 5 Apache warriors stood silhouetted against the afternoon sky, bows drawn. "And ready. Don't move," Silas hissed to his men, his pistol still trained on Shii. "They're outnumbered. They won't risk—" A second arrow embedded itself in the earth, closer this time, cutting off his bravado mid-sentence. One of the Yi warriors separated from the group, descending the slope with fluid grace. He was older than the others, with streaks of grey in his long braids and a face lined by sun and experience. The elaborate beadwork on his buckskins and the multiple eagle feathers in his hair marked him as a person of significance. "She," straightened, recognition flickering across his battered face. "Nantan Tsosin," he said, using the Apache term for a war chief or respected leader. The older warrior's eyes moved from Shii to Elizabeth, then to the armed posse. His expression revealed nothing, but Elizabeth sensed a careful assessment taking place, judgments being formed that could determine whether they lived or died in the next few minutes. "This is tribal land," the war chief said in surprisingly fluent English. "You trespass." Silas lowered his pistol slightly, adopting a more diplomatic tone. "We're in pursuit of a criminal. This Apache took a white woman against her will." The war chief turned to Elizabeth, his penetrating gaze seeming to look through her fever to something deeper. "Is this true, woman?" Despite her illness, Elizabeth drew herself up. "No, I left my home willingly. This man," she gestured to Shii, "saved my life in the storm. He has shown me nothing but kindness and respect." The war chief nodded, as though her answer confirmed something he had already sensed. He spoke rapidly in Apache to Shii, who responded with equal fluency, his words occasionally punctuated by gestures toward Elizabeth and the posse. "Lies," Silas interjected, his composure slipping. "She's delirious with fever. This savage has manipulated her, turned her against her own kind." The war chief regarded Silas with the cool appraisal. "One might give an insect. Shii Naakai was once a respected warrior of our people," he said. "Now he walks the healer's path. His honor is not in question." He turned to Elizabeth again. "But you, woman, why should we believe you? Why would you choose to leave? Your people for one, not your own." The question penetrated Elizabeth's fever haze, striking at the heart of her transformation these past weeks. She fumbled at her neck, drawing out the small pouch that held her mother's letter. "My people taught me that touch was sinful," she said, her voice gaining strength. "That isolation was virtue, that boundaries should never be crossed." She glanced at Shii, drawing courage from his steady presence. "He taught me otherwise. That healing comes through connection, that hands can speak when words fail, that embracing differences brings strength, not weakness." She attempted a few halting words in Apache, phrases Shii had taught her about respect and gratitude. The war chief's eyebrows rose slightly, whether in surprise at her effort or amusement at her pronunciation, she couldn't tell. One of Silas's men shifted nervously, his hand straying toward his holstered gun. Instantly, the warriors on the ridge drew their bows tighter, the tension palpable as a thunderstorm about to break. The war chief raised his hand, and a calm settled over both groups. From within his shirt, he produced an intricately carved pipe, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands. This, Elizabeth recognized from Martha's stories, was a powerful symbol, the peace pipe, used in the most solemn councils and negotiations. "There has been too much blood between our peoples," the war chief said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent clearing. "Too many losses on both sides." He looked at Shii. This one chose a different path, the harder path of healing, rather than vengeance. Now this woman also chooses a new way. He gestured toward the ridge, and the warriors lowered their bows slightly. "We will not fight today, but neither will we surrender what is ours." His gaze hardened as it settled on Silas. "You will leave, these two with us. They will be judged by tribal council, as is our right on these lands." "Absolutely not," Silas blustered, though Elizabeth noted how his hand trembled slightly on his pistol. "The woman is a U.S. citizen. She comes with us." The war chief studied him for a long moment. "You speak of laws and boundaries, yet you yourself cross them when convenient. We found your false deed, white man." He nodded toward the document still clutched in Silas's hand. "Our scouts watched you forge the woman's mark at the trading post. You speak of justice while practicing deception." Color drained from Silas's face as the other posse members turned to him with questioning looks. The forged deed suddenly seemed to burn in his grasp, incriminating evidence of his true intentions. The council will decide, the war chief continued implacably. Both will speak. Truth will be heard. Then judgment will be given. He fixed Silas with a penetrating stare. Unless you wish to contest this matter now, with fewer men than arrows aimed at your hearts. The Apache camp sprawled across a sheltered valley, a collection of wickiups and canvas tents arranged in a pattern Elizabeth couldn't discern, but sensed had meaning. Children paused in their play to watch the stranger's arrival. They're curious. Faces quickly ushered away by watchful mothers. Elizabeth felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some hostile, some merely curious, all assessing. Her fever had broken during the journey, thanks to medicines provided by one of the warriors, but weakness still plagued her limbs. He walked beside her, his injuries tended, but his expression guarded. They had exchanged few words since leaving the confrontation with Silas, who had ultimately retreated with his posse under the unwavering aim of Apache arrows. "What will happen now?" Elizabeth asked quietly as they were led toward a large central structure. "Council decides," she replied. "Elders listen, then speak. We must speak truth, without fear." The council lodge was warm and smoky, ringed by seated figures, men and women of varying ages, their faces solemn in the flickering firelight. The war chief, Nantan Sosin, took his place among them, and Elizabeth and she were directed to sit on woven mats at the center of the circle. An elderly woman with intricate facial tattoos spoke first, her Apache words flowing like water. Over stones. She listened intently, then turned to Elizabeth. "She asks why white woman comes to Apache land," he translated. "Why you leave your people." Elizabeth took a deep breath, sensing the importance of this moment. Speaking slowly to allow she to translate, she told her story, the loveless upbringing, her father's prohibition against touch, her mother's hidden letter, and the storm that had led her to she's shelter. She spoke of their days together, of learning a new language of hands and hearts, of discovering that borders between peoples could be crossed through compassion and understanding. When she finished, a long silence filled the lodge. Then a wizened elder with clouded eyes raised his hand, speaking in a voice that carried surprising strength. "He says your words have the ring of truth," she translated. "But words are wind, actions show the true heart." The elder gestured, and two women entered the lodge carrying a large ceramic bowl filled with steaming liquid. They placed it before Elizabeth, then stepped back, waiting. "Medicine test," she whispered. "They want to see if you remember healing ways I taught." Elizabeth studied the bowl's contents, a mixture of herbs and roots she had watched she prepare during her ankle's healing. With careful movements, she demonstrated the proper way to apply the poultice, explaining in halting Apache phrases the purpose of each ingredient as she worked. The cloudy-eyed elder nodded, seemingly satisfied, but another council member, a hard-faced warrior with a prominent scar across his cheek, spoke harshly, gesturing repeatedly toward Shi. "He says I betrayed my people," Shi explained quietly to Elizabeth, "first by refusing warrior path, now by bringing outsider to sacred places." Elizabeth felt a surge of protectiveness. Without thinking, she reached for Shi's. A hand, entwining her fingers with his, before the entire council. A murmur rippled through the assembly at this public display. "Tell them," she said firmly, "that boundaries exist to be understood, not simply obeyed. That what divides us is less important than what connects us. That touch can bridge worlds when words cannot." As she translated, Elizabeth noticed something unexpected. Several of the elder women nodding slightly, their eyes softening, as they watched the joined hands of the unlikely pair before them. The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling like the wind outside. Elizabeth understood little, but she sensed the tide of opinion shifting gradually, particularly after Shi spoke at length about his healing work and the respect he had maintained for tribal traditions, even while walking his solitary path. Near midnight, as the fire burned low, the council reached its decision. The tattooed elder woman rose, approaching Elizabeth with measured steps. In her hands, she carried a blanket woven of two distinct colors and patterns, one half in the traditional Apache design, the other in the style of settler textiles. She draped it around both Elizabeth and Shee's shoulders, binding them together in a symbolic gesture that required no translation. "She says," Shee explained, his voice thick with emotion, "that new paths are formed by brave feet, that what grows between different soils may be stronger than what grows in one alone." He paused, listening as the woman continued. "We are permitted to stay, but at the edge of the camp. We will be watched, tested. Trust must be earned." Elizabeth nodded her understanding and gratitude. It was more than she had dared hope for, this tentative acceptance, this chance to prove that boundaries could become bridges. As they left the council lodge, still wrapped in their shared blanket, Shee leaned close to her ear. "They rarely accept outsiders," he whispered. "You spoke with power." Elizabeth thought of all the silent years, the words trapped inside her by her father's rigid rules. How strange that here, among people whose language she barely knew, she had finally found her voice. That night, beneath a canopy of stars more brilliant than she had ever seen, Elizabeth and Shee sat outside the small wickiup assigned to them at the camp's perimeter. Between them lay the two-toned blanket, a tangible symbol of their unique position, neither fully accepted nor rejected, but existing in the fertile territory between established worlds. Spring blossomed across the valley, painting the landscape with wildflowers that reminded Elizabeth of her mother's descriptions in the long, hidden letters. 6 months had passed since the council's judgment, and with each turning moon, their position within the tribe had gradually strengthened. Their dwelling now stood at the boundary between the Apache camp and the foothills beyond, a deliberate placement that reflected their unique role. Built in a style that combined the traditional wickiup structure with elements of settler cabin design, it embodied the bridge they had become. "The children are coming," Shee said, emerging from their home with a collection of small clay pots. "The medicine lesson." Elizabeth smiled, brushing soil from her hands as she rose from the garden they had planted together. Neat rows of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, as the Apache called them, grew alongside herbs from her father's farm and native plants with medicinal properties. This blended garden had become both their sustenance and their classroom. Moments later, a group of Apache children appeared, followed by 3 hesitant settler children, the youngest offspring of a homesteading family that had recently established peaceful trading relations with the tribe. Elizabeth watched as Shee gathered them in a circle, his once solemn face now animated as he demonstrated how to grind certain leaves into healing pastes. The children listened attentively, Apache and white alike, occasionally giggling when his deliberate mistranslations between languages created humorous meanings. This was their victory, not grand or dramatic, but profound in its quiet way. 2. Outcasts had created a space where the next generation might learn to see similarities before differences, to reach for understanding before fear. The path had not been easy. There had been resistance from both sides, suspicious tribal members who kept their distance, settlers who crossed themselves when they passed. Silas Morgan had spread vicious rumors in Copper Springs about Elizabeth being despoiled by savages, ensuring she could never return to her former life even if she had wanted to. Yet there had also been unexpected allies. The war chief, Nantan Josin, had recognized the practical value of having intermediaries who understood both worlds. Several tribal elders, particularly the women, had gradually accepted Elizabeth after witnessing her respectful efforts to learn their ways. And a few forward-thinking settlers, tired of constant conflict, had begun to seek out their unique dwelling when injuries or illnesses struck. especially after Elizabeth's knowledge of both traditional and Western remedies saved a child suffering from scarlet fever. As twilight approached and the children departed, Elizabeth and Shee sat side by side on a bench outside their home, watching the first stars appear. His hand found hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Had a letter from Martha," Elizabeth said, referring to the former housekeeper who had become their occasional correspondent. "She says Silas Morgan lost the farm to gambling debts. The new owners are a young couple with children." She smiled slightly. "She says they laugh a lot." She nodded, understanding the significance. The house that had been built on silence and separation was now filled with the very sounds and touches her father had forbidden. There was a certain rightness to it. "Do you ever wish to return?" he asked, the question they had both carefully avoided for months. Elizabeth considered, before answering. "I carry what matters with me," she said finally, touching her mother's ring, which now shared her finger with a simple band Shee had crafted from silver and turquoise. "The rest is just place." He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Apache wisdom says home is not where, but who." "Then I am home," she replied simply. As darkness settled fully over the valley, they moved together into their dwelling. The interior glowed with the warm light of a central fire, illuminating the blended life they had created. Her mother's letters carefully preserved in a parfleche bag, his story sticks displayed alongside her father's Bible, healing implements from both traditions arranged on shared shelves. In the corner, a cradle of Apache designs stood ready, lined with a quilt Elizabeth had pieced together from scraps of her old farm dresses and buckskin provided by the tribal women. Their first child would arrive with the summer moon, a new life that would embody the bridge they had built between worlds. Later, as they lay together beneath the two-toned blanket that had become their most treasured possession, Shee's hand rested gently on Elizabeth's growing belly. There, beneath his palm, their shared future kicked and tumbled, already impatient to begin. "All my life," Elizabeth whispered in the darkness, "I never knew what a real embrace felt like. Now, I cannot imagine a day without it." She drew her closer, his arms creating the circle of safety and belonging she had sought without knowing. "Then we will never stop embracing," he promised. "Not each other, not the child, not the path we walk between worlds." And in that simple pledge lay the healing of wounds far older than either of them, the promise that where boundaries had once divided, touch could indeed build a bridge strong enough for future generations to cross.